Welcome back, friends. This is Asia Pacific Perspective. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and joining us, as always, is our friend Broc West of the Asia Pacific Perspective blog, apperspective.net. I hope you're tuning into it for all the latest and greatest from the Asia Pacific region. Broc, thank you so much for your time. Good to see you.
James, good to be back with you again. We've had a few months off. Obviously, hopefully most of your listeners and my audience out there saw our recent podcast on how to make media, and hopefully some of your subscribers didn't see our karaoke subscriber-only video.
It wasn't that bad.
My vocal cords are still recovering.
Yeah, it was quite a night. Well, thank you so much for that. It was great to see you in person, but now that we're back in our respective locations on the other sides of the AP region, I guess we should be back covering the news, and there is so much going on right now that we have to cram it all in. We've got several stories to take a look at this month, so let's cram them all in, and we'll start, I guess, in something that's happening more in my neck of the woods, and something that's really quite interesting and developing, so let's get straight into the first story.
Sure. Well, this obviously is the newly announced Chinese Air Defence Identification Zone. And we'll take this first story from our good friend Niall Bowie, who's also helping out on Land Destroyer Report, I believe, these days. The title reads, US flyover in China and Japan island rail, will the real provocateur please stand up? Beijing's announcement of an air defence zone while over the Diaoyu Islands would naturally be seen as a controversial due to the dispute with Japan. And because Washington implicitly backs Tokyo's claims, the US administration has taken to framing the issue so as to portray China as the hostile actor and principal belligerent. China has defended its air defence declaration as an extension of its entitlement to uphold its national sovereignty and territorial integrity. Beijing has also pointed out how the US and Japan have established their own zones decades ago, which extend to the frontline borders of other countries in some cases. Beijing's air defence declaration essentially asserts the right to identify, monitor, and possibly take military action against any aircraft that enters the area. And despite the US backing Japan's right to uphold a similar zone, the White House declared China's move unnecessarily inflammatory. The United States and Japan both operate vast unilateral air defence zones, and yet Washington has the cheek to childishly reject the legitimate defensive claims of others. The message derived from Washington's actions perfectly illustrates the nature of the so-called pivot to Asia, even though America's political representatives cannot be relied on to fulfill their long-planned appointments to visit the region. However, the Pentagon can always be relied on to deliver reminders that the US seeks hegemony in Asia. James, yet more posturing in the ever-simmering East China Sea territorial disputes, and unless you're actually within China, I think that almost everyone in the Asia-Pacific, at least from the state's perspective, sees this air defence zone expansion as a pretty provocative and pretty bold move. And unsurprisingly, the US and its closest allies or proxies in the region have almost immediately thumbed their nose at Beijing with flyovers of military aircraft such as B-52 bombers, which we also saw coincidentally a few months ago over North Korea around the time of the Ultra-Freedom Guardian military drills taking place between the US and South Korea. Now, in the last couple of days, it's come to light that Japan and the US are going to play ball to a small degree and notify the Chinese authorities of their commercial aircraft's movements, but I doubt that it's going to happen with any military aircraft, as I'm sure that Japan, South Korea, and the US aren't going to be too keen to be giving up intel so easily on the whereabouts of their air forces, particularly considering the increase of surveillance spy drones that we've seen throughout the region over the last couple of years. So for me personally, that's really where the sticking point is right now. James, what's your thoughts? Is this a game of one-upmanship, a legitimate territorial manoeuvre, both, or none of the above?
I would put my money on both, and it does seem like a pretty provocative ratcheting up of the tensions in a contextless environment, but as the Chinese Defense Ministry attempted to put some of the context to it, the spokesman Yang Yujun the other, I think a couple of weeks ago, was saying that Japan consistently blames others and smears the names of other countries, but never examines its own conduct, and then he went on to say, if they want the air defense zone revoked, then we would ask that Japan first revoke its own air defense identification zone, and China will reconsider it after 44 years, referring to the Japanese ADIZ, which has been in place since 1969. So there's already been a Japanese version of this for 44 years, as the Chinese are pointing out now. So absolutely, it's hypocrisy to expect that other countries wouldn't enact and enforce the same types of things. And really, this is just, I think, a further reflection of the fact that China is building up its military, its navy, and its air defense, and it's starting to assert that in the region. I'm not saying this is a great thing. I don't think the advancement of militarization on any part is a good thing. But at any rate, it would be pretty hypocritical for the Japanese under the U.S. military umbrella to be complaining about this now. So it is an escalation, and I think again this is just part of this trickle of stories that will continue. I have no doubt into the coming years as we start to see the tensions ratchet up just little by little in this new Cold War.
That's exactly right. And obviously, with the continued escalation just comes that mistake, that one misstep, that one diplomatic faux pas that could just set everything off, unfortunately. Of course, none of us want to see that, and we all want to see a demilitarization on all fronts, not just Chinese, not just US, not just North Korean, not just Australian, but from all fronts. But anyway, moving onwards and upwards to another breaking story right now that has been developing quite rapidly over the last week or so, and that's the massive protests that are going on in Thailand right now. And we'll take this story from Alt Thai News, which is an offshoot of the always invaluable Land Destroyer report. Quote, the title is Message from the Anti-Regime Protesters. Quote, in regard to the occurring political situation in Thailand, we the people who strongly oppose the entire Thaksin Shinawatra-backed regime want to see his influence completely washed out from our beloved country. We have lost the trust in the Thai government, a puppet being controlled by the fugitive former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, the brother of the current PM Yingluck Shinawatra. With Thaksin's ghost-like presence in Thailand, we will never achieve our goal if his root has not been eradicated. This has been the largest demonstration in Thailand's history of almost 1,000 years, 2 times larger than during the 1973 uprising and 20 times larger than that in 2010. Millions of people have gathered at the Democratic here in Bangkok of Rajdar Noan and elsewhere across the country as they no longer can accept the widespread Thaksin regime. We can no longer stand the government claiming its victory at elections entitles it to do as it pleases, circumventing the law clearly to the benefit of the Shinawatra family, not to the people who voted him into office. This is a dictatorship democracy against the provision of public will. We can no longer stand to see the media still being under its control, putting the government in the good light. Finally, we cannot stand to watch the country being plagued by Yingluck Shinawatra's administration through disastrous policies and the huge scale of corruption unprecedented in Thai history. So, James, as you can see, these protests have reignited and grown quite rapidly over the last week especially, ever since the proposal of a hugely unpopular amnesty bill, combined with the aforementioned alleged collusion between the current Prime Minister and her brother, who was convicted of mass abuse of power and corruption during his reign as Prime Minister. So far, the protesters have occupied and overrun several important institutions, such as the Top Crime Office, government ministries, even the state-run TV station, among many others. So this has led to the Thai government invoking a special security law, which includes public curfews and the disruption of electronic communications as well. However, PM Shinawatra has vowed not to use force against the demonstrators, but on the flip side, there have been many mysterious black-clad militants causing havoc within the protesters, just as we saw in the protests in 2010. So we'll provide a link to another great Land Destroyer article in the show notes, which really goes into great detail about that. So, however, as of Monday, as we're recording this, the 2nd of December, the two opposition leaders have met with the Prime Minister and the opposition leader of the protesters, and basically the protesters gave her 2 days to completely hand over power. So it's going to be a very interesting, intense 48 hours in Thailand, that's for sure. But James, firstly, what do you say to the detractors, and there are a lot of them, of these large-scale protests that occupy buildings and bring commerce to a halt, and that essentially are refusing to negotiate in any way with the state? And secondly, are there any legitimate alternatives to this, or is this seemingly the only way to remove unpopular and corrupt governments?
It's a very good question, and one that I'm thinking is appropriate for a number of people all over the world who have problems of various kinds with the people claiming to rule over them. And it's always a question of how you engage with that class. Do you play into the system? Do you attempt to vote the bums out every few years? Do you attempt to overthrow it in some popular uprising? I think that there has to be a mixture of different attempts, and I think obviously people have to stand up against what's happening, especially when there are overreaches and abuses of power that are flagrant and in their face. And to a certain extent, it is a healthy sign that there are just huge amounts of people coming, pouring out now into the streets in protest in Thailand. That shows that these people are at least awake and are trying to do something. Is this going to be the ultimate long-term solution, engaging the system like this? Well, I don't think so, and I'm sure anyone who has watched any of my work before knows that I'm more about what people can do on a personal level to sort of change the space that they're in and the community around them. But I think that this type of engagement is at least a necessary stepping stone to get people aware and awake and into these issues. And it should be no surprise that now these Black-Clad protesters who seem to have links to the Shinawatra family's northeast political base there in Thailand are now being released into the hordes to try to mix things up. And unfortunately, this is the way of protests. They can be directed, misdirected, they can be decapitated, they can be put into a type of dialectic against another anti-protest group. So it can go in a lot of different ways, and that's why I think ultimately this isn't the long-term solution. But again, I do think that the anger is an important stage to get people at least motivated into looking for real solutions. So I'm not going to poo-poo it entirely.
Yeah, I mean, we saw similar things obviously happening recently around in the Arab Spring, and namely Egypt comes to mind first of all. You know, they removed the Mubarak regime only for another horrible regime to be propped up again, by Western forces and other insidious forces. So it is a tough situation, but I do agree with you there that, I mean, this is the first step. It's just a matter of unfortunately trial by error, I guess. James, for our third and final stories, we're going to kind of do a bit of a news blast and run through a few things because we just have so much to cover today. So we're going to cover Fukushima first of all, and the removal of the spent fuel rods from Unit 4. It's something that I've been covering and you've been covering a lot on FukushimaUpdate.com. So we'll take this story from Energy Business Review from November 22nd. First stage of Fukushima's fuel rod transfer completed. TEPCO has transported 22 fuel assemblies from Unit 4 of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant in Japan. Loaded into a cask, the fuel assemblies were transferred from the crippled reactor building to the nearby common pool building at the power plant for safe storage. The extraction of fuel from Unit 4 spent fuel pools will pause shortly for a scheduled safety review of procedures and methods, whereas any necessary refinements are scheduled to be implemented over the next rounds of extractions. So as we see, James, the initial removal is of unused fuel rods at Unit 4, and that's taken place, luckily, without any incident. However, the much more difficult and hazardous phase of the operation is only just underway, with the removal of over 1,500 spent fuel rods still to be conducted. Some of these fuel rods reportedly received damage over 2 decades ago, with TEPCO only just publicly announcing it last month. And it's this type of secrecy and lies from TEPCO and the Japanese government that hopefully will give people reason enough to keep their eyes on the ever-developing situation at Fukushima. And James, that segues us nicely into our second update, and that is Japan's passing of a state secret bill. Tell us more about that.
Well, unfortunately, exactly as you say, we have to distrust a lot of what's coming out of TEPCO and the government because they've been caught lying so many times, but that might decrease in the near future as Japan has just passed a state secrets bill that is effectively outlawing the passing of any sort of, or the reporting even of any sort of classified information or information that's deemed sensitive. Specifically, this was a law that was passed last week, and there's a great article from Washington's blog that goes into some depth about this bill. Called Japan Reacts to Fukushima Crisis by Banning Journalism, which I've got posted up on FukushimaUpdate.com so people can check it out there. And as he notes, journalists who obtain information inappropriately or wrongfully can get up to 5 years in prison under this new law. So it's a pretty worrying thing, and you even have Japanese senators now coming out and saying that this is a step backwards towards the fascism of years past. So it is deeply unpopular. Of course it's unpopular with the media here. It's unpopular with a lot of the opposition parties, but unfortunately the Abe government has ramrodded it through the Japanese parliament. So it's now the law of the land here in Japan, and we'll have to see how specifically this is implemented. But it's just another worrying sign for people who are interested in transparency when it comes to Fukushima and everything else that's going on in Japan. Absolutely. It definitely could be a worrying sign for your own FukushimaUpdate.com as well. And just in terms of the
the availability of credible resources that we both try and get up there on a regular basis. So, James, just finally, we'll do a quick update on the TPP as well. Last month, Wikileaks released an entire draft version of the intellectual property chapter of the TPP. Think what you will of WikiLeaks, but it's important that at least some of this completely secret and subversive trade deal is seeing the light of day finally. We are a little short on time today, James, so I'll provide a link in the show notes to the Knowledge Ecology International's breakdown and analysis of the leaked chapter. They kind of put it in much more easy to understand terms and everything, so the audience out there can have a bit of homework and research for themselves. But just quickly on the geopolitical front, we're seeing a few developments with now South Korea showing an interest in joining the tyrannical trade pact, as I like to call it. However, I'm not sure how likely that is given the late stage of the negotiations now. And just yesterday, Japan refuses to concede any more ground to the US regarding tariffs on farming, which was one of the main sticking points for all the Japanese protesters who actually realised how bad of a deal this was going to be for the Japanese agricultural industry. And with, unfortunately, with Japanese and US relations apparently never being better at the moment, I doubt this will have any major impact on the final draft of this sovereignty stripping trade agreement.
We are in the home stretch, so it's going to be very interesting to see how this develops, and I just hope people are keeping an eye on it, because again, this has gone almost completely under the radar, even in the alternative media, and it is a huge thing that's happening right now, so I hope people are going to bone up on it. I'm glad we're giving them some homework. As always, all of these show notes are going to be, all of the documents are going to be in the show notes, so I hope people will go and start checking these out for themselves. And on that note, I hope, once again, people are taking a look at Asia Pacific Perspective blog on a regular basis. Now that you're back in Oz, I know you're updating it regularly, so I hope people will stay tuned for all the latest. Once again, that's apperspective.net, and Broc West, always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm looking forward to talking to you again next month.
Will do, James. Good to see you, mate. Take care.